Erev Tov, everybody. Regards from Baltimore. I'm in my parents' house, where I brought our kids for, I say, our break week, or at least the first half of it. Um, so far the house is quiet, and if I get called away, I apologize in advance. Um, and we are on Parashat Yitro, and I would say a couple of the first few um, Parshiot with Rabbi Abital Hachstein felt a little bit more focused on human qualities with a sprinkling of the divine. Last week, as we looked at the pillar of cloud and the pillar of fire, we had much more of a sense of kind of a focus on the theological or the divine. Um, and this week we get a nice blend, more theologically focused, but a human element as well, and feels like in a certain way a nice continuation of last week, where I think the overall message was the kind of tension of God appearing in that cloud that both created proximity and distance, and that same issue comes to the fore in the essay this week. So let me share my screen. Reflections on divine and human voices at Sinai. So of course, we have Matan Torah, or Ma'amad Har Sinai, the giving of the Torah, the stand at Sinai, in this week's Parashah and Parashat Yitro. And this is, again, as usual, from 5777, 8 years ago. Our Parashah describes the climactic moment of the direct encounter between humanity and God, or more specifically, the people of Israel and their God. Okay, so it's I'm not sure. Once she says humanity and God, and then she says more specifically the people of Israel and their God. I'm not sure what she meant by the first statement, humanity and God, because it is a segment of humanity, but there is a human divine encounter in this week's parasha, which is particularly the Israelites and their God. And two, the kind of bookends, or the framing of that encounter is Vayotze Moshe et ha'am likrata Elohim min hamachaneh vayityatzu b'tachtit ha'ar. Chapter 19, verse 17, Moshe led the people out of the camp toward God, and they took their places at the foot of the mountain. And then a few psukim later, Vaydaber Elohim, God spoke. Okay, so Moshe, we've had a few likrats. Actually, I haven't thought about this, but the likrats in the book of Shmot, Moshe goes out to greet Yitro, Aharon comes out to greet Moshe. So these kind of encounters, I don't know if there's more to make of it. I have to think about it more, but there's something to these likrats, the movements to greet another, that this word indicates. And the same language is used for Moshe bringing the people to meet God, and God speaks to them. And that God spoke is the introduction to the Aseret HaDibrot, to the 10 utterances, the 10 commandments. God's speech is directed towards the entire people in a way that is unmediated. Instead of relaying God's speech through the chain of Moshe, who speaks to the elders, who then speak to the people, or through Aharon as a mouthpiece, God speaks directly. This time, God turns to the people, and the direct encounter takes place after the people are asked to prepare body and soul for this interaction. They sanctify themselves, they wash their clothes, and they prepare to respond to the divine invitation, right? So the unmediated encounter doesn't happen unprepared for. There's steps of preparation that the people go through because they're going to have this unmediated encounter, right? If Moshe is delivering the word of God to them, we don't have much indication of them preparing. Maybe he summons them, but they don't have to do anything. But when God is going to speak to them directly, they have to prepare. It seems that through this direct speech act, God takes a step toward Israel, the tribe, group, and people that God has chosen. Until now, the connection between God and the people was circuitous, going through various intermediaries, plagues, commandments, Moshe himself. This time it's different. This time they truly meet. Now I want to pause for a moment just to say that I think Last week at the splitting of the sea, there is also a sense of the closest that the people got to seeing God. They when they sing the song at the sea, they clearly seem to have a sense of God. But I think that notion is a little bit more rabbinic. The sages say, even a maidservant at the sea beheld God, more directly than the prophet Yechezkel, when God would come to deliver a prophecy to Yechezkel. And so the rabbis developed the idea, based on, for example, Ze Eli va'advehu, and the people say in the Song of the Seer, "This is my God." The rabbis sort of imagine that they really saw God. But we don't have any indication that I can think of that they really saw God or encountered God so directly. The rabbis developed that idea, but the stronger explicit sense of encounter is at Ma'amad Har Sinai. So again, just to note that there is a little bit of a background here where the rabbis build up the people's connection or seeing of God at the Yam Suf, but that really is a rabbinic development, and the direct encounter with God that the Psukim describe, really, this stands alone. So when she says this time it's different, this time they truly meet, I think that's accurate, but the rabbis actually do build up a prior experience in last week's Parsha at the sea. With this context in mind, reading Israel's reaction to God's invitation for a closer, more direct connection is heartbreaking. Israel reacts with what appears to be a rejection, a request for more distance, more for indirectness, for mediation. I'm sitting across from my parents, then my mom seems upset about this, so we'll have to unpack it and understand it. The Israelites turn to Moshe and they say, "You speak to us," they said to Moshe, "and we will hear. But let not God speak to us, lest we die." Right? Daber ata itanu v'nishma, something like that. Let's see the pasuk in Hebrew. After the conclusion of the record of the Aseret HaDvarim, we get through it in verse 14, chapter 20, verse 14. Then we're told that people witness everything. They fall back and stand at a distance. They say to Moshe, "Daber ata imanu v'nishma." You speak to us. It's interesting. The JPS translation here is, "and we will obey," but Rav Avital is going to make it much more of the notion of v'nishma. You speak to us and we will obey. V'al yedaber imanu Elohim pen namut, and let God not speak to us lest we die. Okay, so this is, she's describing it on a first look. It appears to be a rejection or request for more distance, for mediation. You speak to us, let not God speak to us lest we die. In my imagination, I can see the moment where God is longing, trying, wanting to get close to the Israelites by God coming down in the sight of all the people. That's a quote from chapter 19, verse 11. And it is at that moment that the Israelites respond to the possibility of direct communication in the negative. Okay, so again, at the plain sense, we know they're frightened, but I guess her starting point is God must have known, God would not have appeared to them in a way that would have made them die. So they're afraid, but why not somehow overcome that and lean in more? That's sort of that's the question here. There is a stream of exegesis, right? An approach of interpretation that beckons us to understand that the response of the people is not as it seems. Okay, so after she sets it up for us, she's going to, say, not everybody reads it this way. It doesn't express a desire for distance. Rather, it is a demand that reflects a desire to be more directly involved in the covenant. This is not actually they're afraid kind of justification, but this is a different interpretation, meaning Israel isn't asking to be farther from God, but wants to have a say in the way that God and humans communicate. They are trying to take part in defining the relationship that is created by the receipt of the Ten Commandments. What they are actually saying is that without their involvement, the covenant itself will be lacking, right? That somehow, if it's all coming from God only, then there's the covenant is too one directional, and that somehow Moshe's involvement or not making it only from God makes it more of a partnership. Again, this is not the reading that's focused on fear. A possible explanation is found in an exegetical dispute regarding what took place on Mount Sinai. The sages discuss what Israel heard directly from God at Sinai and possibly disagree about the chronological placement of this critical moment when Israel requests of Moshe, you speak to us and we will hear. Right? What we saw was that after God, it says, Vaydaber Elohim, God spoke all these words, saying, Kol hadvarim ha'ela, all these words, and then we get the whole 10 commandments over the next 13 psukim. And then, so we said, all the people witnessed the thunder, and then they fell back and they said to Moshe, you speak to us. So in the plain sense of it, it seems like that response only happens after the completion of the 10 commandments. But we'll see that not everybody understands the Midrash, understands that way in this Midrash. Midrash from Shir HaShirim Rabbah that says Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi and the rabbis, they disputed. Rabbi Yoshua says, 2 commandments, Shnei Dibrot, did Israel hear from God's mouth. The first 2, Anochi v'lo yeh lecha, I am the Lord your God, and you shall not have any other gods besides me. And the rabbis say, Kol hadibrot shamu Yisrael mipei HaKadosh Baruch Hu. They heard all of the commandments from the mouth of God. She doesn't go into exactly what the basis of that difference is, but I think we can understand it relatively straightforwardly. The second opinion, that it's after all 10 commandments, well, that's where it's placed in the chronology. You have the 10 commandments, and then you have the people saying, you speak to us, Moshe, and not God, lest we die. But the first opinion, which is the opinion of Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, I think is noticing the shift in person in the 10 commandments. The first one is, I am the Lord your God. The second is, you shall have no other gods besides me. And then it sort of shifts to third person about God, right? Don't bow down to other gods. Well, there's, for I, the Lord your God, am an impassioned one. So there you have still a little bit of first person, but that's still in the second commandment. Then we get to the third commandment. Don't swear falsely by the name of the Lord your God. Why doesn't it say, Lo tisa'et shemi lashav, don't swear falsely by my name? And then every time after that, God is referred to in the third person. And so Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi presumably is noticing that it shifts from God speaking in the first person in the first 2 commandments to God being spoken about in the third person in the subsequent commandments. That seems to imply that God stopped speaking and Moshe started speaking. And so it would then make sense if we wanted to try to explain that shift to say, oh, well, that's because that thing that Bnei Israel said at the end, Moshe, you speak to us and not God, must have happened after the first 2 commandments. So that, I think, is the backdrop to that to that debate. But what's the debate about is what she wants to ask. Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi and the rabbis are debating about what it is that Israel did actually hear from God's mouth. In other words, they're discussing what was heard directly at Sinai, how much of God's speech was unmediated. The Midrash records 2 suggestions. According to the rabbis, every single one of the commandments was spoken from God's own mouth. However, according to Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi, only the first 2 were spoken by God. Immediately after the second commandment, the people interrupted God and asked God to stop speaking with them in such a direct way. There is a Hasidic description of the 10 commandments that presents yet a third possibility. This is how it is presented by Rav Naftali of Ropshitz. Quote, it's possible that all we heard from the Blessed One is the Aleph of Anochi, I. And now she comments and explains. We can understand these words in 2 ways. It's possible that he, Rav Naftali, is further restricting the amount of communication that Israel heard directly. Not only did they not hear all of the commandments, they didn't even hear the first 1 or 2 in their entirety, right? So you have the rabbis saying, oh, you have Rabbi Yoshua ben Levi and the Midrash saying the first 2 commandments. Now Rav Naftali of Ropshitz is kind of extending the contraction, furthering the limitation and saying, no, it was only the Aleph of Anochi. All they heard was the first sound of the first word of the first commandment. All they heard was ah. Additionally, we can also understand, and I thought this is a beautiful insight, we could also understand that Rav Naftali of Ropshitz is making a metaphysical claim about what it means for the human ear to receive a divine communication. So Rav Naftali of Ropshitz is presenting a paradox. Without a vowel, the sound that the aleph makes is silence. It is the absence of sound. So what they heard was nothing, the sound of nothing, like the still small voice that Eliyahu heard. She could give a whole essay on this and she doesn't develop it further, but I mean, it's a fascinating thing to kind of contemplate the idea that, on the one hand, the first interpretation that they heard the and that in and of itself was so overwhelming that they needed Moshe to step in, or just as the communication began, whatever their experience was of it, even if we take it out of the framework of fear, prompted them to say, no, hold on a second, we need Moshe's involvement. And maybe even without, however we imagine God's voice, without even the sound of the voice coming out, they had the beginning of the experience and then had this reaction. Either way, these different descriptions construct a picture of gradation, either a gradual distancing of God, or a gradual distancing from God, or a reflection of the immense challenge of the relationship between the people and God. From the majority opinion that everything was heard by the people, to the opinion that the people only heard the first two commandments, to the opinion that not even the first word was heard, only the sound of the letter Aleph. However, looking at the verses again, we see that Israel isn't looking for distance, but instead for some dimension of proximity. They do not ask to stop hearing God. What they are asking for is to be spoken to in a way that actually allows them to hear God better. You speak to us and we will hear. Daber ata imanu v'nishma'a. Right? They want to hear. They want to be able to engage in the relationship, and they're asking for Moshe's involvement so that they can. Whatever it means to hear from God, they want to do that, but they want Moshe to help them do that. It appears then that there is something in the way, there is something in the way that they have been spoken to until now that makes hearing difficult for them. There's a stumbling block in the form of communication employed thus far. So we see that the different degrees of distancing described in the Midrash and by Naftali of Ropshitz are also the basis for a type of involvement. For the more we constrict the direct divine voice, the more we expand the human involvement in the creation of the Sinaitic covenant. The more the Midrashic imagination shortens the duration of God's speech, the more the commandments are free to become a product of partnership between man and God. Rav Moshe Alshich, when commenting on Israel's request to hear God speaking through Moshe, presents an aspect of cooperation that was necessary between God and those God created in order to proceed with the rest of the Ten Commandments. Specifically, this is Rav Moshe Alshich, tries to explain how all of Israel were able to hear the commandments after this point. Right? We actually have a problem. When Moshe starts speaking, how did the whole 600,000 men plus women and children, how did they actually hear Moshe's voice? He says, perhaps you'll say that it won't have enough power, Moshe's voice, to be heard in a camp that was 12 mil by 12 mil, given that it is a human voice. The Israelites number many hundreds of thousands of people and more. The Alshich presents a very logical, logistical problem of amplification. How could Moshe's voice, a human voice, be heard by each person in this large camp? His answer is, God who is blessed will join God's voice to yours. And that is what it means when it says, and we will hear. Meaning, she now explaining the Alshich, the people's request that Moshe speak to them didn't have the effect of replacing God's voice with Moshe's voice. Rather, what they heard was a composite, God and Moshe speaking together. The people's request of, and we shall hear, reflects a longing for combination. Now, just pause for a moment to go back to the Pasuk, because it's not a simple reading. In verse 16, where it says, and they said to Moshe, Daber ata imanu v'nishma'a, you speak to us, now her translation, so that we may hear. Va'al yedaber imanu Elohim pen namut, let God not speak to us lest we die, now has to be read as, let God not speak to us exclusively, or let it not be God speaking to us in such a way that we fear that we would die, which is the exclusively divine voice. So it's not a, this is, we're in a slightly homiletical realm here, but I think it returns closer to the pshat, however we could imagine pshat of an encounter like this. It returns closer to the pshat when we think about the Alshech's question, which how could they even hear Moshe's voice? Again, how do we imagine how they were encamped at Sinai? It's all there was thunder and lightning. How could they hear anything to begin with? It's all subject to many, many questions about what could have actually been happening. And again, it's not a simple reading, but it's a fascinating new to me take, which is this composite experience. He continues to ask, maybe you'll say, and what have we gained from this? Either way, you will be hearing God's voice. In other words, if the divine voice is too much for them in whatever way, then how does adding Moshe's voice, solve that problem? Right, James is asking, how do they hear Moshe before then? Yeah, I mean, it's a good question. I'm not sure if did Moshe speak to them? I don't think Moshe spoke to them, and in the full Sinai structure prior to that. There's some going up and down and speaking to the people, but we don't have a full sense of what it means he was speaking to the people. But yes, it's a question. The Alshech's question is a good question for the whole wilderness experience. How when a large group was gathered in an outdoor space and one person was supposed to be speaking to them, how did they hear? I mean, it's a fair question, I think, across across the text. So that may be broader than only here. But we'll take it for what it is here, that maybe this was a unique instance or a almost singular experience of everybody being gathered. And so, the question is stronger here. So that is, if God's voice is still powering the communication, what have they gained and what have they been granted with their request? And he, the Alshech, answers, behold, the combined voice with humanity is not like the unmediated voice of God. The combined voice is vastly different, according to Alshech. And this is what Israel was asking for. They seemingly knew the power of the composite voice, the voice that contains inputs from both God and people, is not a dilution of God's voice, but rather is the foundation for hearing it. Now, of course, I also want to say as we go that, Moshe as the human representative is Moshe is Isha Elohim. He's practically godly, whatever that means. This is not a common man, in the midst who's this is not a common man, who's the representative of the people. But still, there's something to this human input in the delivering of God's word. It appears that according to this interpretation, Israel did in fact want to hear God, and that is their request. They knew that the best way for them to do this required a different kind of divine voice, one that also incorporated the voice of humanity. This raises the question, of course, of why. What was so difficult, so impossible for Israel in hearing the singular voice? And perhaps this is because one-sidedness of this voice makes it unhearable. And this is not surprising, as we're talking about a covenant which is a pact between two entities, a story of two sides meeting. It is true that when coming together, each side must know him or herself as a distinct individual or entity. But as long as in the formation of the covenant or relationship, only one real actor is involved, of course it will be difficult for the other partner to feel whole in entering into the covenant and to really hear it and respond to it. Furthermore, a connection that is created in a way that is one-sided is unbearable, heartbreaking, incompatible with what it means to enter into a partnership. It is out of this heartbreak that Israel begs, let us hear, and this is only possible through a joint voice. She ends, if only we could have the wisdom to request the same, a joining together in order to hear. and to include all of our voices in order to have them heard as well. This is, of course, like a radical sermonic jump that seems to move to a kind of a much different take on inclusivity and hearing of all voices, which doesn't feel like it's what this, this teaching is about. Moshe is a representative of the people, but he's not necessarily a representative of the people. So this is just a little closing message. But what I think we have here is, again, we're further from the text, further from the pshat than I think we've been in some other essays where we had a close reading of a few texts and a theme that emerged from them, and then we sort of tracked the development of the theme or the idea. Here we have a pasuk, the people's response to God's voice, and she's kind of avoided the whole pen namut, lest we die. She hasn't really dealt with that. We'd have to maybe read it sort of homiletically, like, lest we no longer be active partners in this covenant, lest we kind of be like dead members of this relationship. Maybe that's kind of the way to read pen namut in this context. She's really moved away from the sense of the thunderous, overpowering, death-threatening voice of God, which in some way does feel like it's the shot of the story, that just the voice is so thundering and overpowering that they feel afraid for their lives. And she's kind of moved much more to a sense of, the voice is the thing they most desperately want to hear, but they feel that if they hear it coming only from God and without the kind of joint voice of them or their representative as the covenantal partners, then the relationship, God's movement towards them, kind of swallows them up and overpowers them. And it's not actually a meeting, but just a kind of an overtaking. It's not a covenant, but just a demand, an authoritarian demand. So I think the concept is a beautiful concept, and the readings are, beautiful, non-literal readings. And I'm not sure, I think the message is an important message, but it feels a little further afield from the pshat than we've seen. But it also raises some interesting questions. Again, just how much do we want to lean into trying to actually construct a coherent historical description of Sinai, or not. So I think I saw Bracha's hand up, and we'll start there. Great.
Hi. So I had a couple of questions. One is when it says Nishma'a, is that any connection to Naaseh Nishma? Is that a hint to that?
We definitely have that, the Nishma and the Naaseh Nishma, in these Sinai sections. But I don't know, whether so that term is very, very present throughout these passages here and in Mishpatim as well, where we have the Sinai, experience kind of reprised or told again differently, continued. So there may certainly be a connection, but this is the Nishma without the Naaseh.
And also, isn't it Moshe that they had been missing for all this time? Didn't they really need to hear his voice?
That's interesting. I think the missing hasn't happened yet. Right. This is the beginning of the first ascent onto the mountain. And then the missing Moshe happens at the end of 40 days from this time. So right now it seems like Moshe hasn't been gone really at all. He's been relaying messages to them and then gone up to the mountain, and he's maybe he's gone into the cloud, but hasn't been a long time without him yet.
But they're aware that he's about to go, right?
Yes.
So that's even worse.
Yeah. That could be the anxiety of his departure.
Because this hasn't happened before.
Right. Yeah. So maybe they're wanting to be sure that he stays, that they continue to hear his voice. And it's more about their relationship with him in a sense than it is about their relationship with God in a way. Yeah.
But it's nice that they want to combine it. That shows progress.
Yes. Great. We'll go to Nathan, then Lance, and then my dad who's sitting across from me. Yeah, Nathan.
Okay. So first, in response to bracha a little bit. So I don't know if you covered this already before I joined. The word Shema in the Torah is can you guys hear me?
A little choppy, but we've gotten it so far. The word Shema, yes.
Okay, so it could mean here, and it could mean obey.
Yep.
In different places in the Chumash, it's clear which one it means, and sometimes it's not. I think in Nasev and Nishma, despite what the Midrash says, which I think is what Bracha was referring to, the Nishma is probably obey and not hear. And I said the Midrash because the Midrash says, how could you do it before you heard it? So the assumption is it means heard. I think the little
Yes.
In this case, we see both interpretations or both translations. One in the JPS that you showed us, and then which is obey, and then the other one in Rabbi Avital's
Yes.
translation. But I think her solution fuses the two, right? In order for us to obey, we have to be able to hear as a partner.
Yes.
So that I think so. So I think the answer to Bracha's question is actually yes. By saying this, there is a connection, and maybe that was even intentional. That's what Bracha presumably meant, right? Between the Nasa Nishma and this. If you want us to do Nasa Nishma, you have to make us partners.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's one thing. And I just want to editorialize for a second. Rabbi Jonathan Sachs he says in a few places that in Hebrew modern Hebrew there was no word for obey because obey is not a Jewish thing. Now, of course, he admits that Shema sometimes mean it. But if you were in the military and you wanted somebody to obey your orders and you said Shema, that would be confusing.
Yeah.
Right? Because it also make it here. So the actual word he said from the Arabic, Sayyid, I think he said.
Yes. Let's say
which is the word they use in the military to mean orders. Right? Yes. They don't use Shema. No other actual Hebrew word, so that's part of that. Okay. The other thing I wanted to say, which is about the Rav Naftali from Ropshitz.
Yes.
Right. So, and you may have been intimating this. This idea that the Aleph is silent, so you hear nothing, and she doesn't develop that. You said.
Yeah.
So it seems to me that the Hasidic master, you would want to be able to say that they didn't only hear God, we can also hear God. Listen for the silence, and we hear him as well. Right? That's a very Hasidic way to think about this.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
As opposed to say, oh, we hear nothing, but they hear it so much. Right. So, but of course that wasn't the direction she wanted to go. She wanted to go to limitation. Yes. I think Hasidic generally want to expand the relationship between, Jews and God, not to limit it. So that's how I read it. But okay.
Beautiful. Beautiful. Yeah. Just appreciating all those three comments. I would say that, I just was skimming some of the translations and they include, there's kind of split on hear and obey. And I agree with you. I think in general, in biblical Hebrew, Shema B'kol is clearly obey, and Shema can go different directions. So I think that's absolutely true. And I like your interpretation. And yes, the kind of point of no word for obey is interesting. That Sayet is what came to my mind, which is not a biblical Hebrew term. And yes, and the last thing I'll say just about the Aleph is, I think I've even mentioned this here before, that my biblical Hebrew teacher, Professor Richard Steiner, always taught us that Aleph does actually make a sound. It's less audible than the guttural ayin, but he said it's the sound you make when you lift a desk. It's just like a subtle grunt is what the Aleph sounds like. So maybe they heard that, who knows? But yeah, great. Thank you for all those comments. Lance, go ahead.
Well, you're talking a lot about voices. Where is the voice of Aaron?
The Kohen asks, where is the voice of Aaron?
And I've got a lot more to say about that. Exodus 19, even the priests who approach the Lord must consecrate themselves, or the Lord will break out against them. Where does it come from? Because if you look at Exodus 28, God told Moses to set apart Aaron and his sons to serve as priests. that seems to be the beginning of the priesthood right there. And that's 8 chapters later. And for me, the biggest problem of all is this. Also put the Urim and Thummim in the breastplate, the breastplate piece, so they may be over Aaron's heart whenever he enters the presence of the Lord. Thus, Aaron will always bear the means of making decisions for the Israelites over his heart before the Lord. What decisions has he made? Where
I don't.
key decision that Aaron made? I
Right.
don't know. Do you know of any, Rev Stephen?
I think the people did consult the Urim V'Tumim, and therefore Aharon as the reader of them for various questions. I'm trying to remember if do we have textual evidence of any specific one, right? In later books, clearly people go to the priest and ask the Urim V'Tumim, should we go to war and that kind of thing. But do we have an instance of Aharon? I can't think of one.
It seems to me there are tremendous contradictions here. I'm listening to all what has been said about the obey and about Shema and so forth. How many, what do you hear? No commandments, 2 commandments, all the commandments. What do you hear? It's all extremely difficult to put together, it seems to me.
Yeah.
There's no consistency here. There's no underlying current that moves us through this. And for me, at least, Cohen again, the Samaritans, 10th commandment is Mount Gerizim, is the holy mountain. 10th commandment in the Samaritan Torah, which is, almost word for word the rabbinic Torah. And I've never figured that out. I can't understand how you could have 2 identical Torahs.
Yeah.
Maybe one was stolen from the other, but I don't know who stole from which. If that's the case.
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
just have a lot of questions here. And the final one is what Rob Avi brings up in his commentary is, what is the difference between commandments and statements? And you could say, what is the difference between commandments, statements, and words? Because commandments, as far as I know, first appears in the Geneva Bible, which, by the way, is Shakespeare's Bible. The Geneva Bible talks about commandments. Before then, I think it's words. So there are tremendous problems here. Tremendous.
Yeah, great notice things. Thank you. And I'll just say that, Exodus chapter 19, the kind of preparation for the receiving of the, whatever we call it, Aseret HaDvarim, is a very hard chapter to follow. I mean, even the fact that it ends, so God said to him, go down, come back together with Aharon, but don't let the priests or the people break through. And then it says Moshe went down to the people and spoke to them. And then it says God spoke all these words saying, so did Moshe go back up? Where was everybody? It's and that's just kind of the beginning of the complexity of the movements back and forth in the chapters. The idea that even the confusion about how many, how much of God's voice was heard is, not surprising. Professor Benjamin Summer has an amazing book in which he, dissects this. He takes a, text critical approach and kind of dissects the narrative into multiple strands, but uses it to kind of talk about the different ways of thinking about revelation and the human divine relationship. There's a lot to kind of unpack and read into this chapter. And so it's agreed. It's not surprising that there are things that are contradictory and confusing. This is a moment of, on the one hand, you could say if it's God's revelation, we should expect to be completely clear and everything should be straightforward. We could also say it makes sense that there's something slightly chaotic, incoherent, confusing about it. Dad, you had a question.
So I'm just wondering who these Israelites are. I imagine them at least thinking, not saying this to God, but you took us out of Egypt. You split the Red Sea, and now you're establishing a covenant with us. Don't talk to us or at us. but rather talk with us. We're no longer slaves.
Mm-hmm.
And they want a different relationship from what they've had with rulers for the last
Mm-hmm.
210 years.
Mm-hmm.
They want to start afresh.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that would be a long way for them to develop in a few weeks' time. And maybe that, but maybe I'm selling short the way they already were, meaning maybe they were ripe and ready for a different kind of experience with their leader, capital L leader. And so once they were freed, they were kind of more demanding of that. I think the question is better than the answer. How do we imagine the personalities, the hopes, the visions of these Israelites? I mean, when I close my eyes, I only see the ragtag band of people in robes that you see in Hayehudim Ba'im, that satirical comedy sketch series. Kind of like the group that I see. They were a difficult bunch, but yeah, it's fascinating to think about what stage were they at, what were they looking for. Absolutely. David L.
Yeah, I want to add to the list of questions, not the list of answers.
Great.
I guess we're back in chapter 19 when the nation says, Kol asher diber Hashem na'aseh v'nishma. Right? Does it say nishma? No, na'aseh.
Yeah.
And
Ishma only comes in Parashat Mishpatim.
they're not asking questions about how the communication is going to happen. God says to Moshe, "Hinei anochi ba elecha be'et ha'anan ba'avur yishma ha'am." So God really wants them to hear. And God's expectation is the people might break through, that they're going to want more closeness. So I think that the mismatch of expectations that Rav Avital was pointing to is really quite correct. But I think that there are two sort of basic questions. I'm scrolling here in Safari to see if I can get back to the place. The first is, it says, "Vayidaber Hashem kol hadavarim ha'ela lemor," right? And then we have the whole list of the Aseret HaDibrot, or the Varim, whatever you want to, however you want to pronounce that. And then it says, "V'chol ha'am ro'im et ha'kolot," that the nation sees now, even if, whether you want to say that it's thunder or whether you want to say it's voices, they're having some experience, a sensory experience that is unusual, to say the least, that they're seeing the voices. So even if you wanted to, when it comes to saying, they're seeing the voice of the shofar. And then when they say pen namut, it really calls out and feels like they have a different sensory experience that should have been there. Lo yirani hadam v'chai, that no person can see me. And they've somehow translated it into no one can hear me, which is rather odd, because Moshe has come to them and said, God has spoken to me. And they have these traditions of God having spoken to the Avot. So it seems like there's some really much more basic questions that I wish you would explain.
Thank you. What can I say? Yeah, they're great. They're great questions. Thank you for adding them to the list. What is the nature of God's voice it's really fascinating. I'm glad you added that broader context that kind of questions why would God's voice be so terrifying to them. God spoke to their ancestors, not infrequently. So what was the quality of this experience? How did the divine voice manifest that created this? I will note, along the lines of this whole teaching, there's an amazing, I've taught this before at the Bayit, there's an amazing Likutei Moharan of Rabbi Nachman, where he really leans into this kind of the need for buy-in and the need for partnership. And he actually reads Kol asher diber Hashem na'aseh, everything that God says we will do, as the people's kind of complaint that if God says it, we will have no choice but to do it. And we want to be able to exercise free will in this relationship. And so we need a moderating of the commanding voice to incorporate the human element so that we actually then feel that we can enter willingly as opposed to coercedly, into this relationship. And that's why God says to Moshe, I'm going to come to you and I'll speak to you and the people will hear so that this becomes possible. Then this Rabbi Nachman adds a whole other layer on that Moshe then says, but wait, what about me? I also want to have free will, and adds this whole additional piece. But so there's just, this, I think everyone's loading onto this chapter and this moment, all the feelings and theologies and questions we have about what's the nature of the human divine relationship, and, what kind of a partnership, what kind of a covenantal partnership is it? So I think it's a lot here. Yeah, back to bracha. Thank you, David.
Yeah, I sort of think that the voice of leadership that they were used to hearing for hundreds of years was Paro, which was a frightening voice. So they naturally transfer that to God.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. And they were, after all, kind of told, God tells Moshe to tell Paro that the whole idea of the Exodus is to go out and serve God. What does God tell? What does Moshe tell the people about that, and what's even their initial expectation of what this relationship is going to be? There's a lot. These are such packed parshiot, and these weeks in biblical history are so packed and so intense. So, yeah, just scanning the crowd again for a moment. Great. There's so much here, and so much here, and a lot to think about as we, unpack this and listen to it this Shabbat. And the question of what is the nature of our partnership with God. And I certainly hear Rav Yitz's echoes here also about empowering human beings more, and kind of that movement through history. So more for us to reflect on. And so far planning to, bracha, last word, please.
Yeah, it's interesting that this is all centered around voice, because I just came from a Nigun session. So there's something really amazing about the parallels here.
Yes, great. And yes, I hear the kolot in the background where you are. So we have all of that, in the space. So thank you to everybody so far. We should still be on for next Monday night, which is President's Day night. But I expect to learn together for Parashat Mishpatim, my dad's bar mitzvah parsha, and looking forward to that. So I can say love to mom and dad who are right across the table from me, and go back to hanging out with them. And a wonderful rest of the week for everybody. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye, Tov.